Welcome to this video lecture for Philosophy 203. The topic for today is ethics and religion. Before really beginning, I'd like to point out a couple of things about modern religions. Modern religions generally all have in common some things, and of course there are exceptions, especially in a field as broad as religion, but in general, modern religions have sacred texts, right? They all have some standards of behavior that is both within specifically religious practice, like when you're doing things that when you're actually performing religious functions or ceremonies or things like that, there are standards of behavior, but there are also standards of behavior for members of various religious communities and faiths. And modern religions generally all have ideas about the purpose of human life, about what we're here for, what we're supposed to be doing, and those ideas tend to inform some sort of ideas about what the ideal life is or what it's supposed to be like. And so because of this, and a lot of times people will get the idea that religion and ethics are very much closely intertwined. And while it is true that modern religions do say things about ethics, what that seems to indicate is that religion requires ethics, right? I think that it would be odd, right, to see some notion of a religion that didn't have any form of standards of behavior or didn't have sacred texts that sometimes counseled certain kinds of behavior or character. And I think that we would not regard such a thing as a religion in the modern sense. And so to some extent, again, religion does require ethics, but is the opposite true? Right? Is the converse true? Rather, does ethics require religion? And that's going to be the topic of both today's readings and, of course, then today's lecture. Our author, Russ Schaefer-Landau, breaks this down, the notion of the relationship between ethics and religion down into three separate claims. One is the claim that religious belief is required for moral motivation. The second is the claim that if there are moral facts, then they must be created by God. And the third claim is that religious wisdom is the key to providing moral guidance. Now, I'm going to address these in a slightly different order than Schaefer-Landau does, for the reason that I'm going to sort of do the shortest first and then the second shortest longer, and then the one that involves the other reading for the day, we're going to take that last. So first, let's start with the third claim, that religious wisdom is the key to providing moral guidance. Right? This is the view that God can provide correct advice about morality. Not necessarily does, but can. But not because God creates morality. Remember, that's claim number two. Those are two different things. There's one role for God in morality as a kind of expert moral advisor. Another role for God in morality is as morality's creator or determiner. And again, we'll take a look at that other view when we look at claim number two. This is just the view that God is as a moral advisor, okay, as that sort of a role. And again, the claim may well be true. Certainly, we don't know that it isn't, but it does, on the one hand, leave non-believers to look elsewhere for any form of moral guidance. So it's of sort of limited scope, but also leaves believers with two very interesting and important tasks. The first of those tasks is identifying God's moral advice. And again, this is something that many modern religions address by having a set canon of sacred writings. But of course, the process of determining which writings out of all of the writings available really were sacred was at the time controversial and is today somewhat controversial. Also, there's the notion of interpreting God's advice, right? So once you have a set of the right sorts of writings or relayed revelation, you of course then have to decide what it means, and that's very often not a trivial or easy task. In any case, both of those are beyond the scope of an ethics course. If you're really interested in such questions, you should take a course in the study of religion, comparative or otherwise. But we're going to go ahead and leave off this claim for now. That's about all that we'll say about it here, is that it doesn't really help us much, or it starts to take us far afield of our focus in ethics. And so let's then take a look at this first claim, right? The first claim that Schaefer-Landau identifies, that religious belief is required for moral motivation. This is a common notion, at least fairly recently. this idea that without believing in God, then somebody wouldn't have any reason to do the right thing. And I think that at the very least, it may be true that people who are religious may feel that that gives them a reason to do the right thing. I don't know that it's the reverse is true, that those who aren't religious have no motivation to do the right thing. And those are some of the troubles. In fact, Sheffield-Landau identifies 3 problems with this claim, and these 3 problems really just are the major 3 problems with this claim. And the first 2 are counterexamples, right? The first one is that at least some clearly moral motivations are also clearly non-religious. So again, think to a time when you've had to make a difficult decision or a moral decision, or you've seen somebody else having to make such a decision, and you're wanting to evaluate their decision, really how good a decision it was. Well, one thing that people often consider is whether anybody will be hurt or harmed by whatever they do or decide. That seems to be relevant to us. And it seems like that alone is enough. So if somebody says, well, gosh, I'm thinking about doing this, that, or the other thing, and if you say, well, that sounds wrong to me because it would harm these people in this particular way, it seems like that's the end of the justification there, right? It seems to be a good reason to do something or not to do something to avoid harming others. And yet that's not specifically a religious motivation. It may be that religions, many of them, would say not to harm, right? But it seems like just the harm itself is enough motivation, absent from any of its advocacy by any particular religious tradition or text. So that's one counterexample. Another counterexample is this. It seems that at least some explicitly religious motivations are clearly immoral. So the example I've written here in the notes is, for example, the auto da fe, the burning of heretics at the stake, right? It's clearly a religious motivation, but sort of clearly immoral. Looking back, we can see perhaps a little misguided. So again, it's a kind of counterexample. This is not to say anything about all religious motivation, but at least some. So specifically, the final claim is that specifically reward or punishment motivations do seem to miss the point of morality. I think this is the strongest objection here. We can start debating examples and counterexamples for a long time, and I think they do their job. But I think this is the biggest problem with this particular view that religious beliefs is required for moral motivation. Because the idea is something like this, right? That people have to have some notion of some form of reward or punishment after this life, or some ultimate arbiter of right and wrong, or just and unjust, in order to accept that there is such a thing and be motivated in order to do or not do certain things. As the writer Dostoevsky famously put it, if God is dead, then nothing is forbidden. A bit of a paraphrase there, but that's a fairly famous aphorism. And the idea seems to be that without having this ultimate reward or punishment, that people have no reason to either do the right thing or refrain from doing the wrong thing. Now, I just want to push a little bit on this idea because I think it's the idea that most motivates this claim. So one of the things that you just imagine teaching young children about morality, about doing the right thing. So, for example, imagine your child, like cleans their room and and even starts straightening up the kitchen, doing the dishes without being asked, and and as a parent, you might say, hey, that's really good behavior. I want to praise that and say, well done, child. You have done the things you're supposed to do without necessarily having to be told to do them. I think all parents really sort of like that. I think that's a sort of a kind of right thing to do. And then if the child says, well, look, I only did it because I was hoping for some reward after I was done, right? Then you'd be like, okay, well, that's progress maybe. At least they know what they're supposed to do, but you think they sort of missed the point, right? I mean, if all they really wanted was a reward out of it, right? Or say some child was being, like, say, really nice to their sister, they didn't hit their sister even though their sister did something that might have otherwise led to conflict, and say, well, good job not hitting your sister. It's like, oh, well, I only did it so that I wouldn't be punished, right? I don't think there's actually anything wrong with hitting my sister, right? Again, if they say things like that, you think, oh, well, they kind of missed the point, right? Like if they're really only concerned with rewards or avoiding punishments, that they're not really quite getting the idea that there's something good, right, about fulfilling your responsibilities, or something bad about hitting people, right? those sorts of things ought to be motivators aside from the rewards or punishments. And so the idea is that this would represent a sort of misunderstanding of morality if that was all that anybody was ever after, was just rewards or punishments. And I think we all do really feel that way. And so that would be a problem for accepting this claim. All right, so then let's turn our attention to the claim that's going to take most of our time today. And this is that second claim that Schaefer-Landau identifies, that if there are moral facts, they must be created by God. This view has a special name in philosophy. It's known as the divine command theory. I'll be abbreviating that DCT in these notes. And it says this: it says that things are right or wrong just because God commands them, right? So the things that God commands you to do are right, and then the things that God forbids you from doing are wrong. And they're right or wrong because of the command and nothing else. Okay? And so I wanted to point out some notable features of the divine command theory. So first off, at least from our perspective, it is an objective theory of morality. It says that what's right or wrong is right or wrong for everybody, and that's just the way it is, right? It's based on some feature, right, of the world, in the sense, whatever God in fact commands is right, and whatever God in fact forbids is wrong. So it's at least objective, okay? That this gives it a leg up over theories like cultural relativism or even moral subjectivism. But what else is rather interesting about this is that the view itself is not very commonly accepted, even by religious philosophers. And the reason for that is, as Schaefer-Landau points out, and as is pointed out in the accompanying reading, the Euthyphro dialogue, that there's a logical problem with this particular approach, right? And the problem is one that religious philosophers and philosophers in general call the Euthyphro problem. That's how you say that word, Euthyphro. It's an old Greek name. The Greeks had the best names. It comes from a dialogue written down by Plato between Euthyphro and Socrates, right? And so there's a bit of that excerpted in your text. But of course, the actual dialogue between Euthyphro and Socrates is much longer than is printed in your text. I believe it's available in your course readings, like the full version of it. But of course, what's assigned is only the little excerpt out of the text. It focuses on the part of that dialogue that we're most interested in. But I think it makes a little bit more sense if you understand some of the background. So I'll go ahead and tell you some of the background, some of the stuff that's not in your text excerpt that helps to set the scene for this really important realization. And so before I get to that background, I wanted to say one more thing about the Euthyphro dialogue. Now, the Euthyphro dialogue is, again, written by Plato, and so that means it dates around the 4th century BC. That's in the 300s BC. And so notice that's rather prior to the advent of most modern religions. And so when they talk about God or the gods, they're talking about the old Greek gods, what we now call sort of Greek mythology or the Greek pantheon. And that's a different thing. That's an ancient religion, and so ancient religions didn't have necessarily quite so much this notion of of a divine command theory or of a kind of morality that goes along with it. The behavior, for example, of the Greek gods is not always or not even very often virtuous. So that's just an important thing to note. But again, the problem is not with the way that any particular modern religion is or any of the particular teachings of the modern religions. The problem hits divine command theory right at its roots, and it's a well-known problem for views of that kind. All right, so back to the Euthyphro dialogue. Here's some background. So basically, all of Plato's dialogues between Socrates and some other people, they generally start with Socrates just in some casual situation, either just hanging out in public or talking with his friends or at something like a bar, or in this case he's standing in line at the courthouse, right? He's waiting for his court appointment, and Euthyphro is waiting for his court appointment right along with Socrates. So they strike up a conversation. And it turns out Socrates he's waiting to be charged with a crime, with the crime of corrupting the youth by a young man named Miletus. And Euthyphro is actually waiting in line to charge somebody with a crime, namely his father. He's planning on charging his father with the crime of murder. And so, they talk a little bit about Socrates' problems, but then, of course, when Euthyphro's problems are brought up, that's much more interesting, even though Socrates' charge will eventually result in his death. If you're curious about that, you can look that up. You can find stories about Socrates' life and details of his trial and death pretty much everywhere. And so the Euthyphro describes the situation as follows. I'm just taking this as a direct quote from the text here. Euthyphro tells Socrates, well, the victim of this murder, as a matter of fact, was one of my hired men. And when we were farming in Naxos, he was working for us there. Well, he got drunk, became angry with another one of our household slaves, and slit the man's throat. So my father bound his feet and hands and threw him into some ditch, and sent a man here to ask the interpreter of religious law about what should be done. But during that time, he paid no attention to the bound man and neglected him, thinking him a murderer, and that it would be no big thing if he died as well, which then, in fact, happened, as he died of hunger and cold and of his bonds before the messenger returned from the interpreter. So these are the circumstances that he tells, which today would be called manslaughter, legally, probably. Rather than something like premeditated murder. But it's they didn't quite have the same legal distinction then as now. But in any case, it's still a crime, and a very serious crime, and so that's the crime he's going to be charging his father with. Now, Socrates, of course, expresses some surprise that Euthyphro would bring a charge, number one, against his own father, and number two, on behalf not only of just a servant, but a servant who was himself a murderer. Now, of course, Socrates' surprise seems a little less strange to us today, because, of course, we're used to a system where the law applies equally to everybody, and that doesn't sound quite as strange. But it did sound very strange to Socrates. So Euthyphro says, well, look, I mean, I know that he says even some of his own family were surprised at him and were very angry with him. But Euthyphro asserts that it's on account of his expertise in piety or holiness. So those are two words for the same thing, that he is so sure of the rightness of laying this charge. He believes he is doing the will of the gods. He's doing the right thing here in laying a charge against his father, because he says, look, a murderer is a murderer, right? And the act is the same, right, in the sight of the gods. And so Socrates becomes interested. This is how all of these dialogues go. Socrates will start up a conversation. Somebody will claim to know something or be an expert in something, and Socrates will say, hey, I've been looking for one of you. Please tell me what you know. I love nothing better than to learn. And so Socrates asks him then for a definition of piety or holiness, right? Because he says, look, if you're an expert in this, I want to know what it is. And so the first thing that Euthyphro tries out, he's like, well, look, what I'm doing right now, that is charging my father with murder here, is what is holy, right? Then, of course, Socrates says correctly that an example of a thing is not the same thing as a definition. He wants a definition. So Euthyphro says, oh, okay, I see what you mean, Socrates. Well, then he tries out a definition. So Euthyphro then suggests that holiness is what is loved by the gods, and unholiness is what they hate. Right? So this is his first attempt at a definition. And so Socrates talks to him for a little while, and this is again before the excerpt picks up here. He talks about the gods not all agreeing about everything. In fact, he says, look, do you think like all the stories they tell about the gods are true? And Euthyphro says, yeah, they're true. And not only that, there are a whole bunch more stories, right? And I know them well. And so again, these stories he's talking about are the stories that we now call stories of Greek mythology. And if you're familiar with any of them, you'll know that many of them include quite vicious feuding between the gods over this thing or that thing. And so Socrates asks him, look, do they quarrel and bicker and make enemies out of each other? And he says, well, yeah, they do it all the time. And he says, well, so do people become enemies over, disagreeing about which of two quantities is bigger, or which of two piles of goods is larger or smaller, or other sorts of things like that? Simple matters of fact, and of course, people don't. He says if they make enemies out of each other, it's because they disagree about important things, like things that they really love or that they hate, things like goodness or badness or justice or injustice, rightness, wrongness, those sorts of things. Those are the things that people have meaningful disagreements about. And Euthyphro agrees and agrees that the gods, in fact, do bicker and quarrel about all these sorts of things. And so it seems like they don't all agree on a variety of things. And so defining holiness as what they all love, or unholiness as what they all hate, seems not to leave us with much. And so Euthyphro recognizes the merit of Socrates' objection, so he modifies his definition. This is one of the great things about the dialogue format. It gets to show people in the process of thinking, right? So what will happen is that somebody will have an idea and somebody will point out something that might be a trouble with that idea. So they modify the idea to account for that problem, and then they can make progress. And so he modifies his definition. He says, okay, fine. Holiness, then, is what is loved by all of the gods, and unholiness is then what they all hate. So sure, they have disagreements, but there are at least some things that they all do agree on, one way or the other, and holiness will be what they all love, unholiness what they all hate. Right? And it's at this point that Socrates really shows some brilliance. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to object to some of the previous attempts that Euthyphro makes at defining holiness, but this one is pretty brilliant. And again, forms the real sort of reasoning that we're concerned with. So again, what follows is what is called now the Euthyphro problem, or the Euthyphro dilemma. Okay? So dilemma means that there are sort of two branches here to follow. Both of which are going to be undesirable in some way. That's usually what we mean by dilemma. And so in a sense, Euthyphro is going to be saying that, look, either things are holy because they are loved, right? Or things are loved because they're holy. This is what Socrates proposes to Euthyphro. And he asks him a question. He says, look, are things pious because they're loved, or are they loved because they're pious? And it's a little bit unclear in the translation. He goes through some things that make a lot more sense in Greek grammar than in English translation. But in a sense, this is what he's asking. He's asking, what depends on what? Does the holiness depend on the being loved, or does the being loved depend on the being holy, right? Because it would be important, right? If you're giving a definition, it seems like you need to be able to sort this out. But let's start with the first dilemma, right? The first lemma, as we say, the piece on the left, right? It says that this idea that things are holy because they are loved. Okay? Well, if that's the case, then it seems like any time one or more of the gods change their minds, the status of what is or is not holy would have to change, right? Then it wouldn't be one of those things that all of them like or all of them hate anymore if one of them simply changed their mind. So in other words, there's nothing about the things themselves that are holy or unholy. It's all about just how the gods happen to feel at any given time. So in other words, as I put in the notes here, if this is the case, then holiness is what we say is arbitrary. That is, there's no reason for it. It just happens to be the way things turned out. Right? There's nothing about any individual action itself that is or isn't really holy. It's just an artifact of how a bunch of the gods happen to feel at any given time. Well, that would mean that holiness to some extent doesn't mean anything, right? It's just sort of again, arbitrary, reasonless, and nobody likes that conclusion, right? So we think, oh no, holiness actually means something. There's actually something there. There's some fact of the matter. There's something about an action that would make it holy or unholy, and so that means really that we want to reject this lemma and go to the other one, or the one on the right there, that things are loved because they are holy. Okay? Well, if that's the case instead, well, that means that there are features of things, right, that make those things holy or unholy, and it is simply recognizing these features in them that causes the gods to either agree about or disagree about. But if this is the case, if this is true, things are loved because they're holy, then the holiness or unholiness of things has nothing at all to do with the gods. And so if this lemma is the correct one, then holiness is independent of the gods. And so this is why it's a dilemma. This is a problem for any such view, is that on the one hand, either holiness is arbitrary, or on the other hand, it's simply independent of the gods. And so it seems like Euthyphro's definition then runs into this very serious problem, that either way you go with it, you end up with something you really didn't want to say. Okay. Now, I think it's probably fairly clear how this applies to something like the divine command theory, but let's make that explicit. Okay? And so, again, the Euthyphro dilemma would apply to it as well. So again, one lemma is that things are moral because they are commanded by God, right? That's the divine command theory. And so again, if this is the case, then anytime God changes God's mind, the status of what is or is not moral changes. And that would mean that there's nothing about things themselves that are moral or immoral. It would instead be all about how God happens to feel about them at any given time, which again would make morality arbitrary, right? Arbitrary. So morality in some sense wouldn't mean anything or wouldn't really exist. It's just, happens to be an artifact of whatever is commanded or forbidden. Right? Well, that's not very desirable, so consider the other lemma, that things are commanded because they are moral. Well, again, if that's the case, then there must be features of things that make those things moral or immoral, and it is recognizing those features that causes God to command them. But again, if that's the case, then the morality of things has nothing at all to do with God. Morality then is independent of God. And so that's what the problem that the Euthyphro dilemma makes for the divine command theory. And that's what leads the divine command theory to be rejected, right, nearly universally, even by religious philosophers. So because then it would either be arbitrary or independent of God. But notice the Euthyphro dilemma has even greater, more broad application than just that. I really wanted to point this out about this particular argument form, because it will be just generally useful for all kinds of things in this particular course. So imagine that somebody had in mind some other kind of moral authority. So the thing about the divine command theory is that God is being treated as a kind of moral authority, right? As not just as an expert moral advisor, as in that first claim that we talked about, claim number 3 from Schaefer-Landau, but rather as, again, an arbiter, right? Somebody who, because they say so, right? That morality is the way it is. And this could be, again, some particular kind of text, some particular sort of wise person, if you think of like the wise man at the top of the mountain or whatever, right? Think of anything you like. And it seems like this person would run afoul of the Euthyphro dilemma as well. Because again, on the one hand, they are either moral because some moral authority says they are, okay, in which case morality is arbitrary, or they say what they say because of the actual morality or immorality of those things. That is, they're recognizing something in things, right, that makes them right or wrong. And so in that sense, morality is independent of that moral authority. So again, either arbitrary or independent. And so one very common idea that people have is about something like agreement, right? This is something of a confusion, right? They might say, well, look, one thing that's true about all of our easiest and most obvious moral truths, murder is wrong, torture is wrong, those sorts of things, are that people agree that they're wrong, right? Well, again, this mixes up potentially what depends on what. Do people agree about things because they're moral, right, on one end, or are they moral because people agree about it? Well, if it's the first thing, then any time that the majority would change their mind, well, then morality would have to change. And that would make morality arbitrary. That would make it essentially meaningless. But on the other hand, if things are agreed upon because they're moral, then that means there are things that people are sort of responding to, right? Things that make something obviously right or wrong. And that would mean that morality is independent of that agreement. That is, that if people all didn't agree about a particular thing, then they'd simply all be wrong. Okay. So again, the Euthyphro dilemma is a big-time general purpose argument against any kind of appeal to agreement or authority or anything else like that. And so it does, in fact, cover that claim that Schaefer-Landau explores about something like divine command theory. It does show that sort of either way you have it, you've got something that's pretty unpleasant. Right? Well, so how does Euthyphro really respond to this? It's like, well, okay, after the excerpt is over, there's still more dialogue where sort of Euthyphro tries a few different things to try and respond, and Socrates generally points out that these responses are fairly weak and that he hasn't dealt with the essential trouble. In fact, Socrates puts it this way. He says, "If the beloved and the pious were in fact the same, my dear Euthyphro, then if the pious were loved because of being the pious, the beloved would be loved because of being the beloved. And again, if the beloved were beloved because of being loved by the gods, the pious would also be pious by being loved." Right? So this is a fancy way of pointing out that it turns out to be somewhat circular, right? But as it is, Socrates continues, you see that the two are opposites and completely different from one another. That is, that one can't depend on one another, because it then would make holiness either arbitrary or independent of the God. So I'm afraid, Euthyphro, that when you were asked what in the world the pious is, you did not say at all. So if I am dear to you, don't keep me in the dark, but tell me again from the beginning what in fact the pious is. And eventually the dialogue ends with Euthyphro just saying, oh, well, some other time, Socrates, I'm in a hurry to get somewhere. It's time for me to go, right? That's how these usually end, where people like, gee whiz, Socrates, look at the time. Because again, it's a problem that doesn't look like it can be dealt with in any really straightforward way, other than simply abandoning the claim that led to that problem to begin with. So this ends then our discussion about the relationship between morality and ethics, and I want to again just sort of highlight some of the most important pieces of that. So again, certainly religious traditions do say things about ethics, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that ethics requires any particular religious view or religious commitment. Neither, because you can have a concept of moral motivation, of wanting to do the right thing, that's independent of any particular religious motivation, and also because you can have a notion of moral fact aside from any moral lawgiver, right? And in fact, the divine command theory has two very unpleasant consequences, right? Either, right, it would make morality arbitrary, or morality would simply be independent, and then we just don't have to worry about the divine command in the first place. So the Euthyphro problem does sort of usefully illustrate troubles with not only divine command theory, but any other sort of command theory, or any sort of mass agreement or contract theory of morality. All of those seem to run into the same basic trouble. Trouble was noticed something like 2,500 years ago. So generally, when we want to talk about ancient wisdom, that certainly qualifies as ancient.